Today I want to ask one big question, and that is, how can the Black Lives Matter movement help us to understand our current political moment? Um, and to that end, it might be worth thinking, why can we talk about the return of the political? So, in a way, where did the political go in the first place? And to that end, I want you to think about the London riots in 2011. Some of you might remember this from the news, or some of you might have studied this in the past. And if you remember them, you might remember that after the riots happened, there were this series of what I'm calling here the post-political readings of the riots. So these were basically a number of scholars and theorists commenting on the riots. Now, the riots happened in early August 2011 after Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the police in North London. So they started in London and soon they happened all across the UK. And the riots were characterized by many different forms of action in the streets. And one of the most publicized one was looting. And these post-political readings that I'm going to be talking about briefly really engage with that side of the protest and the riots, which were the looting. So here we have Slavoj Žižek, who in a very Slavoj Žižek fashion was talking about the riots just a few days after they happened, saying that, like it had happened in Paris in 2005, the UK rioters really had no message to deliver. He then went on to say that he couldn't really explain these riots as kind of a class movement in Marxist terms, but it was closer to the Hegelian rabble. Now, this sounds like big words, but actually what's happening there is that Zizek is saying that there were no political demands behind the protests and the riots, and it was just extreme and somewhat mindless violence. A few days later, or before now that I remember, Zygmunt Bauman, a very distinguished sociologist, commented that the riots were not hunger or bread riots, but were riots of defective and disqualified consumers. And now this is not saying that the people who were rioters were only consumers, but it's a broader comment on what seemed to be the spirit of that age, that we had all been somewhat reduced to being consumers, and that the political, in the sense of having struggle organized through democratic means or even through violence, about the meanings of life, or where do we want to go as a society, how do we want society to look like, had been expelled somehow, and we were all now just consumers. So in a sense, being labeled or feeling as a defective and disqualified consumer was a profound affront on these people. So for Bauman, what was happening with the riots was that this stigma of a life unfulfilled was being expressed in this violence, unable to deliver a political message. Now, there are many critiques to be made of these post-political readings, but I want us to stay with them for now to help us to think, how can we say the Black Lives Matter movement might be the return of the political, or a specific form of the political. And to that end, I want us to think more specifically about the case of Black Lives Matter here in the UK. So that image is from where the Colston statue was in Bristol. And I want to highlight a few things about the specific history of Black Lives Matter in the UK. And I want to then link that to how can we think about the return of the political. So the first thing I want to mention is that there seems to be a connection to the 2011 riots. So Gareth Millington, a sociologist at York University, writing on the riots in 2016, mentions that a lot of the people involved were connected to a movement in the United States called Black Lives Matter. Now, this is obviously way before Black Lives Matter became something incredibly important at the global stage. So we can already see that there is a connection there, an underlying current connecting the riots with Black Lives Matter. To my knowledge, there is not yet a story written about this, but it might be interesting to do so and ask the people protesting today if they were in any capacity involved in those riots, and maybe we can discover there a connection that would, of course, challenge the post-political reading, and perhaps will let us know how those riots might have shaped the political action of people today. But I also want to suggest that they are rooted in a much broader history of anti-racist and political blackness movements. And here I'm quoting Dr. Jon Narjan, who works on these topics, and he has incredible talks online if you want to know more about this. But what I want to say with this is that it is linked, the Black Lives Matter movement is, to already existing grassroots organizations that come together in a concrete moment in time and space, and that can be Bristol, London, but also the United States, and indeed other places across the world. So what I want to highlight with this is that these sudden eruptions in a moment are normally linked to these broader movements, grassroots organizations that many times work without getting too much media attention and suddenly emerge. So that's a way in which we can understand how a social movement suddenly appears. It's not that sudden, and if we look a bit more into the history of it, we realize it was coming from a previous organization, a previous political effort. But I also want to suggest that there is something deeper going on here with Black Lives Matter movement, something that is new, something that calls upon us to think about what the political means today. And I think it's a powerful critique of the very foundations of contemporary Britain. And that has to do with the role of colonialism and empire in things like the making of citizenship. So you can think, for example, about the Windrush generation, how rights can be exercised by those people or by us living here, and obviously through the lived experience of injustice and inequality. So despite being linked to these previous movements, we can explain them just by that. We need to take into account this broader context. And here I'm quoting Dr. Luc de Noronha, who works in the University of Manchester. And again, he's been thinking in very interesting ways about the question of citizenship and the Windrush generation. So this leads me to suggest to you that Black Lives Matter movement, it's a struggle over space. And we can see that in the way in which the Black Lives Matter movement took over urban spaces. Now I'm an urban sociologist, I'm always thinking through the city. And not only over space and its physical control, but also about the meaning of that space. So removing statues in that regard is a challenge over the meaning of public space, but certainly also related to a struggle over life. And here we can think about the demands against police brutality happening, especially in the United States, but certainly all over the world. And this is very important because then we can see that the Black Lives Matter movement, which has a very specific set of characteristics here in the UK, is connected to other movements across the world. So I've mentioned the United States, but we will see that there are indeed others that are relevant, which might not be named Black Lives Matter, but that share this kind of claim over space, over the meaning of space and over life. And this leads me to also think and suggest to you that these movements are not homogeneous or unified, but are plural and in constant change. So that's also something particular about new social movements, that they are different from those that maybe we can think about a political party, or we can think about union politics. They are different from that in the sense that they are changing constantly. Obviously, the movements have been criticized in different ways. This is a picture from my hometown, Mexico City. And behind that barrier, you had a statue of Columbus. So every 12th of October, when the conquest or the discovery, depending on how you frame it, of America is either celebrated or in a way criticized, there are many political interventions around that statue. And this year, the statue was removed by the Mexico City government. And this led leading sociologist Fernando Escalante, a Mexican sociologist who publishes a column every week on a national newspaper, to say that it is now fashionable to try to erase traces of the past because it's thought that it should not have happened. And this is obviously a take that we've also seen here in the UK and indeed elsewhere, but I want to suggest is something different. And I want to suggest there might be a revolutionary moment. And here I'm thinking about Walter Benjamin, the German thinker, and his notion of what is a revolutionary moment and the revolutionary classes. So he says that the revolutionary classes, when they are acting, they are trying to make the continuum of history explode. And then he gives this excellent example about how in the French Revolution, people were shooting at clocks in public plazas because they were trying to signal the arrival of a new time. So I want to wonder and think with you if this might be something that we are seeing today. If this fight over the meaning of public space might be trying to make this continuum of history explored, or try to recover histories that have been somewhat silenced and bring them back to the fore. And there are several ways of doing this. And one of them that we are seeing mainly in the United States, it's that it is a democratic challenge in an established system. So here, for example, I'm thinking about the calls precisely to defund the police that are rooted in the very specific history of policing in the United States that have to do with all the knowledge we have about police brutality and its unequal racial characteristics. Now, you might be aware of this, and a lot of representatives and politicians in the last election in the United States at a grassroots level, again, were running with tickets based on defunding the police or reforming the police in a way. So this is one way in which the Black Lives Matter movement is connecting to social change, and it's a bit more through kind of party politics. And you can't reduce the Black Lives Matter movement to this party politics, but it's important to acknowledge that it might be connected. And I think it's also important for us to think if that is happening somehow in the UK, and if so, in which ways. But I will say that it's also something else that is not just limited to elections and those moments. So it can be a process of redefining the form and meaning of public space. So on the image, you have an old neighbor of mine. I live in London, despite teaching in Bath. I live in North London, and this is South African revolutionary and anti-apartheid activist Tambo, who lived in Muswell Hill in North London. And very recently, a statue of him was inaugurated in a park very nearby, and then there is now a push to change the name of the park to his name. And I want to suggest that this is not only a symbolic or a cosmetic change, but it might be a way to highlight how an unsuspecting neighborhood in North London is connected to global histories of anti-apartheid, anti-racist struggle, and to global politics. And I think that having this sort of statues here signals the fact that London, and indeed the UK, have been for a long time places where many different cultures, many different politics come and become mixed and emerge. And I think it's very important for that to be recognized, because it speaks about this need of creating a new history, a new connected history. And I also want to suggest that there might be something else at stake here. And a lot of research on social movements, especially in Latin America, but also in places like Italy that are pushing for autonomy, are working with that notion that the point is to change power without taking power. That the goal is not maybe to take the power of the state, but to change what we understand by power. And the image behind it's from a Zapatista community in South Mexico, and it says, we want a world where many worlds fit, or where many worlds can exist at the same time. And I want to suggest that there might be something like that happening with the challenge that the Black Lives Matter movement poses, not only to urban space, not only to politics, but to all of us in thinking what power means and how we are part of it. And with that, I want to suggest that the big challenge here is that the Black Lives Matter movement is asking us to think differently about what citizenship means, to think about, let's say, the connected histories of empire and colonization, not only in the UK, but certainly across the world, and how that might change citizenship, but also how those stories might change how we belong to certain spaces, and the politics of social movements in urban space. So I mentioned that push to change the name of a park nearby here in London, but there are certainly many other initiatives that are seeking to reflect that this has always been a very diverse space where many different histories come together. And now to really end, I want to suggest that there might be indeed other forms of enacting social change related to the challenge that the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements that are similar or share some of its motivations might be at play. And I want to suggest this one because I think it's really fantastic work that is happening in my discipline of sociology, but might be interesting for all of you. And it's this challenge of connected sociologies, which are led by Professor Gurminder Bhambra from Sussex University and her team. And what they are doing is taking this notion of decolonizing academia, decolonizing the curriculum, and giving it a very meaningful and important content that is asking how processes that we might have overlooked, like the Haitian Revolution, which is represented in our image, challenge our understanding of our contemporary societies. So I think that is an important question for us who are in the field of education. And it's a thing we can do with a critical mind. How can we create a more connected sociology? It's not about denying what we already learned, but how can we bring other forms of knowing and other processes and understand them as making a connected world? And I want to suggest that this is also a struggle over meaning, over space, and over what life is today. So that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.